Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to this conversation today. I'm Brigham McCown, Senior Fellow and Director of the Initiative on American Energy Security here at Hudson Institute. I have the great pleasure, and it's such an honor to have Secretary David Bernhardt here with us today. Secretary Bernhardt is the only, I'm told, person to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve as both the Secretary of the Interior, the Deputy Secretary of the Interior, and the Solicitor General, or the General Counsel at Interior. Is that accurate?
That's true.
Wonderful. Well, by way of introduction, he was Secretary at Interior from 2019 through 2021 during COVID, during a period of great systemic change and transformation in our country. Originally hails from Rifle, Colorado, and has a long service of history. We were talking a little bit beforehand, and we could actually talk about your qualifications, I think, the entire time we're here today. But you clerked at the Supreme Court?
No.
Without a lawyer?
No, I did a young internship at the Supreme Court.
An internship at the Supreme
Very different.
Court. Served in the George W. Bush administration at Interior.
That's right.
And then started the Trump administration at Interior as the deputy.
That's correct.
Great. Well, what a service of history you have at the Department of the Interior. And, you know, I think to many Americans, we think of the Interior Department as an enigma. It's, okay, it's got parks, it's got monuments, there's something about fish and wildlife. But in actuality, your portfolio of assets is $300 billion plus, 65,000 plus employees.
That's right.
And a pretty substantial budget.
That's right, about $18 billion.
$18 billion. Just kind of kicking us off here, I guess my first question is, you know, can you tell us a little bit more about Interior and why Americans should care that it's a very critical part of our executive branch?
Well, sure. Interior administers about 1 acre of every 5 acres of land in the United States. And it does that based on direction for each particular parcel that has been provided by the U.S. Congress. So Congress may have said, this particular area should be a national park. This particular area should be a wildlife refuge. This particular area should be managed according to principles of multiple use. And so Congress sets the standard for the management of the land. But in addition to these land management responsibilities, a lot of activities take place on those lands. And so you have the production of all forms of energy, you have mining, you have timber, you have grazing, you have a whole host of activities. And then on top of that, Interior has the Bureau of Reclamation, which is responsible for delivering water throughout the West for both farming and municipal and industrial purposes to about 25 million people. And then on top of that, outside of its land management responsibilities, the department serves as the trustee to the American Indians and holds in trust for Indian tribes and individual Indians about 55 million acres of land that they manage for them for their fiduciary responsibilities and for their financial responsibilities. And then beyond that, it serves as a regulatory agency for a host of laws that Congress has passed, such as the administration of the Endangered Species Act for things that are outside of these lands. And so it really serves a very, very important purpose. When I was a young attorney, I was given a choice to go to the Department of the Interior or another federal agency. And a person in this town said to me, you need to go to this other agency. It'll be so much better for your career. Like, it's just lifting and it'll be phenomenal. And then I called somebody from my hometown in Western Colorado, a little town in Western Colorado. And the person said to me, I can't imagine a more important agency than the Department of the Interior. And the reason that is because the management of these federal lands and how they're managed is so critical to the whole country, but in particular to the communities that depend on the access or the management of these lands for their own future. And so for me, it's always been a very, very important agency.
Yeah. Well, picking up with that theme, some people talk about the need to balance competing interests in the land. Do you develop it? Do you allow use or access? From your perspective, what is this intrinsic sort of debate about? And are we using the land as it should be used?
Well, I've always thought that in our system, the first question is who owns the land, and so there's a host of land that is private land, and there's state lands, but when you get to federal lands, the ultimate arbiter of what happens on federal property is really something that is the prerogative of the Constitution. People don't often realize that there's a specific clause in the Constitution that says Congress has the authority for these lands. And as a result of that, my view has always been that Congress picks and chooses what they want to have happen with this property as long as they have it. And they can decide, as I said, they can decide it's a park, they can decide it's something else. There's often not a lot of controversy about how to manage a park. I mean, there may be issues about access or who has access or what forms of access, but generally the parameters of park management tend to be less maybe controversial than when you get to lands that are managed for multiple uses and multiple purposes, and those tend to be at Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, a little bit of the Fish and Wildlife Refuge System, and certainly at the U.S. Forest Service. And in those areas and jurisdiction, they're managing the land to meet a variety of purposes that Congress has described. And in meeting them, there's often a planning process to try and figure out what this property, how this piece of property should be managed. There's interaction with the state and local communities and the public, ideally, and they're trying to figure out how to balance the uses that Congress has described. But all too often that gets mistaken for they're balancing whatever uses they see fit. And I think that's a misnomer. If Congress wants the purposes to be balanced for some particular thing, and they give you a list, that's the list. And if you want to change the list, the best thing to do is go to Congress and change it. Okay.
And consistent with that, so I'm 0 for 1 so far, but I want to ask the second question. Did you, during COVID, with the government shutdown, personally retrieve garbage on the nation's mall on or about Christmas Day?
That's actually a true story, and that is in my in this book. You Report to Me, which, by the way, is a great book for holiday presents, birthdays, a whole host of things.
Right here.
But what's that? There you go. All right. Well, there you go. It turned out that it actually wasn't. This predates COVID. It was during the government shutdown in December of 2018, and I described this event in the book where, as a reaction to typically during government shutdowns, issues associated with the access to national parks can get a lot of visibility, and so in a government shutdown before 2018, the Park Service director had actually erected a barrier to keep people out of the World War II Memorial, which is here on the Mall in DC. And for those of you that are here, you know that facility is completely accessible Like it doesn't, it's like part of the mall, and it's an important memorial. And there was a lot of controversy during that shutdown about keeping people out of it during a shutdown. And my boss at the time, in early December of 2018, was then Secretary Zinke, who's former Navy SEAL, felt very strongly that we should try and maintain as much access to the parks as we could during the shutdown, and that was a great idea. What happened is the shutdown went a little longer than maybe our initial plan expected, and as a result of that, on the mall, trash really built up. I looked for a couple of solutions to that, and one of the solutions I came up with, which was really not even a solution, but just a step I could take, is I asked for a pickup from the Park Service so that I could go pick up the trash, because apparently no one else thought that they could do it. And now the Park Service didn't really trust me with the best pickup, so they gave me a 1985 dually, and so I went and got the truck, and then I went down the mall, and I learned a lot. In fairness of, having a little bit of opportunity to do some facilities work, I learned a lot about, for example, the how far people will walk to put their trash away from a food truck and stuff like that. It was really a good experience. But I'm out there picking up the trash on Christmas Day, and I literally have, pretty much every person that's walking up or down the mall telling me how bad they feel that I'm picking up trash on that day. So it was really an unusual experience.
Did they know who you were?
No. And one of the things, one of the consequences of that, I made a decision to utilize what are called recreation fees to address this trash issue during the shutdown. I realized we had the money. I decided that we could use them this way. And what it allowed me to do is put the folks who do this work back to work, because they were, because of the shutdown, they were not working and they were not getting paid. And they are hourly wage earners. And this was having a tremendous impact on their lives. And so I could immediately put them back to work. They could have an opportunity to get out and do their job, and they were thrilled. And so I made some great friends by doing that, and it was a good thing to do.
Well, keeping on the topic of your book for just a moment, which I don't know if we can zoom in on the book or not, but it is available at your favorite retail reseller. I got mine from Amazon, I think.
You can get it anywhere.
It is out there. Some of the things I find really interesting about the book, though, you talk about the dysfunction in government. You talk about, from your perspective, the founder's intent for government civil service and how that has changed. And again, that's probably a topic we could talk about all afternoon, but could you give the audience a brief overview of what you saw and what your observations have been? How has it changed in, say, the last 20 years?
So I went into the executive branch for the first time in 2001. And there's a few of you in the audience today that are pretty young, and so this may be a great life lesson for you. I went in to do a particular job, and I was immediately told I was doing a different job that I didn't want to do. That may happen to you in your career. But I was really lucky. I was sent to a very small office within the Department of the Interior. And that office, the people in that office believed fundamentally that their job was to help the secretary, whomever the secretary was, achieve their mission within the confines of the law and whatever facts were presented. And that experience of working with a team that could be really, a team that was dedicated civil servants taught me a couple things. It taught me that if I worked with them, I could get a lot more done than if I didn't. And so it made me learn that I could leverage what I wanted to accomplish with their help. And it epitomized to me the way the civil service should work with the political appointees. And remember, in the executive branch right now, there's probably about 3,800 political appointees and 2.2 million civil servants. So in order for government to function, they have to, ideally, they'd work together. What I experienced, and what we highlight in the book, is far more than what happened at the Department of the Interior. We actually looked at a whole host of agencies and interviewed people about their experiences, and that's highlighted in the book. And what you see is a lot of real conflict between the political appointees and the mission that the political appointees believed the president had given them, and where the civil servants wanted to go, to the point of not merely not doing the work, but even willing to go and do the opposite of what the president wanted. And I have a very big concern about that. And so the book spends a lot of time talking about how you might want to address that and why it's important. And here's fundamentally my concern, that at the end of the day, we have elections. And at times, the person I hope will be president will be elected, and at times they won't. But whether they are or not, the civil service has to move forward with the policy objectives of that president, consistent with the law that exists. And if they don't, my fear is that people will lose faith in the processes of government. And what I highlight in the book are a number of instances where I believe career officials have decided to ignore the policy vision of the president, the law itself, and even the regulations. And we can't have an arbitrary government and have people have faith in it. And so I try and highlight those examples, and the book spends a lot of time talking about how to deal with those examples and why they exist. And so that's really the purpose of the book.
You know, that reminds me, coming from my last assignment up in Alaska, someplace you know pretty well as well. We talk about NPRA. Which, by the way, I tell them used to be the Naval Petroleum Reserve.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
And ANWR. It's interesting because under the Alaska Native Settlement Claims Act, under different regulatory pieces, you have people who want to develop land, and a lot of it's on federal land, and they feel like they're being frustrated by Washington. And we were talking earlier about hope and local communities. Could you address that a little bit, and this notion of why are people thousands of miles away telling us that we can or cannot try to have a livelihood in our hometown?
So it's very important to recognize that there's a real perspective on how these lands should be managed, right? And it can vary. And I'll give you an example. When I was going through my confirmation process, I met with a senator who basically, didn't like, was concerned about my policy views on energy development. And I explained to him that my views really were about the question of the impact that a federal decision maker can have on activities that are happening near a community. And the reason I raised that is because these communities in the West were often developed with the expectation that activities would take place on these federal lands. And if you say they're not going to take place, you then are literally taking the hope away from the community. And that senator said to me, well, there aren't very many people out there. And I'm like, well, it's like there's 11 Western states that are largely public land. And so there is in fairness, this land is owned by the federal government. But communities developed out there, and they have hopes that they will be able to thrive and move forward. And I think decision makers need to be thoughtful about that when they decide to change the legal regime that we have lawfully, to change it, they need to think about what does that mean for that community. You can have a community that you say, okay, we really should eliminate a coal mine on federal land. Well, what does that mean to that community for the next 40 years? And so what you see is a tension in a lot of policy initiatives where an entity, or maybe the Department of the Interior, has a policy proposal, and that proposal would hit a community or a county or a state in a way that is very different and very impactful. And so that's where the frustration comes from. And ideally, that frustration would be resolved on the ground. But sometimes it's not.
And consistent with that, and we started to touch on this though, what is the right balance for use? Because now we're starting to hear people say a use is no use. And I don't know if that seems to me to be different. And we get into this with respect to as we're looking at energy resources, how do we remain or get back to energy independence at home, and the need to maybe extract rare earth minerals, critical elements, or critical minerals,
That's right.
rare earth elements. What's your take on the use of public land for energy specifically?
Well, I've worked in, different presidents set different dynamics. And so I worked for President Bush, which had a sort of an all of the above energy approach. And I worked for President Trump, who, his fundamental policy was energy dominance, like he wanted energy dominance. And at the end of the day, I'm a believer that cheap, affordable energy that's plentiful is good for America. I believe that, and I believe that we have great regulatory regimes here compared to getting it from other sources in other places, and I think we absolutely need it when we think through. And we can be for all sorts of energy development, but if you look at the economic growth in the 2000s, what you see is that energy, that particularly the technical revolution associated with the development of shale resources, was a tremendous economic driver. And then when I served in the Trump administration, I was able to see the flexibility that President Trump had on international issues because we had a strong position on energy. And it was very different than the experience I witnessed with President Bush and Vice President Cheney. I was actually in a meeting once where the whole issue was about energy and where we might need to access it on federal lands. And as the meeting ended, it was clear that the president was thinking a lot about the future need of protecting places, doing things in the Middle East to protect our energy interests. A few years later, in the Trump administration, you didn't have the same dynamic, and that to me was very, very important. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a believer that the federal lands should play an important role in traditional forms of energy, but my view is largely irrelevant. At the end of the day, a president gets up, or a candidate, and they lay out to the American people the vision that they have. And in my opinion, the Biden administration has a vision of like climate activism and priority. And so that drives their energy policy. And in fairness to them, they were transparent to the American people in laying out that vision before the election. I mean, what you see is if you go back and watch some of the presidential debates even, there's a lot of discussion about different visions of energy in the presidential debate. President Trump has one vision and says one thing, and the candidate Biden says another. And so to the extent that the American people choose a policy, then they get to, or a candidate with the policy, they get to live with that policy for a while. And now what's striking to me here with this administration is a couple things. Number one, right out of the gate, they lost some cases in court because they tried to overreach. But then even a Democratic majority in the House and Senate curtailed their energy policy on leasing by mandating policies. And this is before the Republican House came in. So what you saw is a response to some degree to their particular policy, and that's the way the system works. And then we have an election, and people decide how they feel about that policy. And then, every administration is 1,461 days long, right? And then there's another one or a second one, and that's the way it should work.
So I think it's been said in town by somebody you haven't mentioned today yet so far, elections have consequences.
That's true. I believe that.
And so this whole government approach that the current administration is undertaking has actually been fairly transparent from your view.
My view is on day one, I may not agree, I don't agree with a lot of the policy, but I'm not, at the end of the day, on day one, the president signed an executive order that said, stop Keystone Pipeline, and listed a whole series of regulations that they wanted looked at. And if you look at the Department of the Interior, you'd see that even as late of last week, new regulations were coming out that said, based on day one order, we've looked at things and we want to go a different direction. And now, do I think their direction is not the best course for the country? Sure. But does that matter? No. What matters is what the American people think and want.
Well, so speaking of pipelines, and we've had our fair share of pipelines over the last few years, Mountain Valley Pipelines back in the news, another federal court case, Fourth Circuit on that one, which traverses federal land. Is our permitting system broken? Let's take a look at NEPA for a second. How are we doing with NEPA?
Well, for those of you that don't know, NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. And in many ways, the policy, this act, I've always thought was a great idea from this perspective. Essentially, the law says, before you take an action that might have a significant effect on the environment, you need to think, and when they say action, what they really mean is approve or fund or carry out something by a federal agency, that you, number one, think about alternatives and their consequences to the environment. So number one, think about options and those effects. And two, it requires an element of public participation, which means people have an opportunity to comment on these ideas. And the goal of those two things together is, number one, to factor in these considerations into your thinking and make a more informed decision, okay? Now, when I got to the Department of the Interior in the Trump administration, I would get this is all done through typically a process called an environmental impact statement. And I would get a document that looked like this, okay? And I ultimately issued a memorandum that laid out a need for page limitations to these documents. And I did this because how could I be more informed if I didn't read it? And we'd get these documents, and there would literally be 40 signatures of people who had who had previously reviewed the document. And then I'd ask them questions about it, which they couldn't answer because they hadn't read it. And so my view is why can't we get this down to something that is readable? And what had happened over time is they thought the bigger the document they write, the better it'd be for the courts. And my view of that was if you give me a document that has 25,000 pages, I bet you I can show you where the right hand said go one way and the left said that you went the other. And so I had some very simple ideas. Mine was put the cost of the document on it, shrink them down, make them readable. And then I made everybody who surnamed these documents actually begin to read them And what happened is the documents got much more concise. They got more effective. And we went from BLM taking 4 years to do an environmental impact statement. In 1 year on average, we went to 1.2 years, okay? So number one, the process, a lot of the challenges in the process are built in to just the way we do things. And so there's some administrative changes that could be made. And in the Trump administration, as you know, because you were at transportation, we spent a lot of time working together to reform the process for NEPA without changing the substantive legal standards we're talking about. And just a few weeks ago, Congress accepted and adopted some of those changes. But your question is, do they go far enough, I think? Right. And the question about that is that probably not. What we're going to find is that there's still a lot of slowdown in the system. It takes about 7 to 10 years to approve a mine on federal lands in the United States. That's a long time if you think you need critical minerals in the future. These processes are all procedural. They don't change the substantive standard. And so they can be shortened. The Congress said they have to be done in 2 years now. We'll see how that works. That's very exciting. They embraced the idea of page limits. I was very excited about that. So I'm hoping that we're making progress.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was hearing Congressman Peters, Democrat from the San Diego area, talking about how important it is to have reform and he was talking to his audience saying, look, you want these renewable low carbon projects. Well, guess what? It's the same process. It's the same law. Right. And he said, I've heard this referred to as a bedrock environmental law. He goes, no, it's not. It's not Clean Air Act or Waters of the U.S.
It's all procedure.
It's all procedure. And at the end of the day, as long as you check all the blocks, the decision can be whatever you want it to be, even if it's adverse. So it doesn't really change an outcome. Is that accurate from your perspective?
Number one, you're absolutely accurate. And what you're seeing, the reason some of these changes are happening is exactly what you're saying. Seeing people on all sides of the energy paradigm are realizing that to do anything is going to require us to improve our permitting processes. And so you're absolutely right. And when in the early 2000s, just when some of these wind projects were very new ideas in solar, I actually had an applicant come in and meet with me at the Department of the Interior, and they explained what they wanted to do on federal land. And I said, well, you can submit an application, but you're going to have to go through the National Environmental Policy Act. You're going to have to go through the Endangered Species Act. Like, these things are going to take time. And what they said to me is, well, no, we're different. We're clean energy. And I went, well, great, but Congress hasn't said that. So you get the same soup that everybody else gets, right? And so you're absolutely right. And they're beginning to realize that for this, to deploy the technologies that they want required significant changes. And so some were made, and there needs to be many more, and we're going to see them, I think.
Yeah, so leaving the state of the American electric grid aside for a minute, if we are to electrify vast pieces of the country, whether it's home heat or whether it's EVs, we'll take EVs. To get to several million cars, let alone, I think we have 290 million cars in America, almost as many cars as people. We would need to mine 3 times more lithium than is currently produced in the entire world just for the U.S. So, and you're saying 7-ish years, 10 years.
Maybe if you don't get a bad federal court decision.
Okay. And maybe the battery technology changes, but assuming you need these materials, we're really talking 2 decades out.
Oh, I think that's right.
Is that?
I think that's absolutely right. Without change, you're talking a very, very long time. And the other thing is the system has to be certain enough that a person would want to make the investment
Ah.
to go through that, right? And have confidence in the outcome. You look at something, you mentioned Mountain Valley Pipeline. They've gone through process after process after process, and then through get an approval from an agency, and then through court action and lost over and over and over. And some people would say, well, that's life, right? But if we do believe that we need to build things and develop them, we do have to ask ourselves, like, who at the end of the day decides? And you know, should the scope of review be different or improved? And those are legitimate questions.
Mr. Secretary, you brought up something which was on, you know, risk. And, you know, do you hear this often, which goes along the lines of, look, if we're going to invest capital, we're going to deploy capital in a project, regulatory or government risk has to be factored in. And when one day 1 and 1 is 2, and the next day it's 3, and we don't know what it's going to be next year, that has a chilling effect on wanting to put capital into new infrastructure projects. Is that?
Undoubtedly, and I think that was demonstrated. The truth of the matter is, whatever you think about the policies of the Trump administration, the Trump administration had a pretty significant deregulatory effort. And it's my view that the confidence in that deregulatory effort itself stimulated activity. And I don't think we can just keep throwing up hurdles and not think that it has an impact. When I put the cost of NEPA on the cover of documents, you know, I was pretty confident that you get in front of a judge and you say, look, Your Honor, I know that these folks would really like us to do it again, but the process we went through cost $18 million, and you're asking us to go back and do it again. You know, is there maybe a thought about the magnitude of the error before we do that? And I think if society knew clearly the costs associated with all of these things that we do, it would really help the American people get to a point of greater consensus. And what troubles me is that we hide a lot of these costs. They're not transparent, and they're hid through, you know, no one really knows how much your energy bill is, right? You just get it, and then it goes up. But do you know what fees are what? I think transparency is the way to say, like, look, this is what you're subsidizing. Are you comfortable with it?
Okay. Love it. How about we open it up to a couple of questions?
course.
Are you able to take some Q&As from folks?
I'll give it a shot.
Here today. Okay. Who has a question for Secretary Bernhardt? Anything we've discussed or anything else that's, I don't know, can I say that? Anything else that's on their minds regarding to it? In the back of the room.
I'm Peter Busey, and I'm a senior fellow here. At one time, I was assistant to the Secretary of the Interior for International Energy and Environment.
Oh.
And everything we did to try to promote energy development was killed by the White House. And that's one of the reasons I quietly resigned. But we were producing roughly 13 million barrels of oil when Donald Trump left office. We're around 11 now. In your sense of our public lands, how much could we produce if we wanted to? I mean, do it in an environmentally sound way, but how much could we increase compared to where we are today?
So I think the real answer is a lot more than we can imagine. And the reason I say that is because, you know, what you see is, in my opinion, is folks are not going to change their, if you have a vision that you really want people off federal land, it's very hard to create an incentive for them to want to be there. And that's a policy vision. But if you look, I'll give you an example. If you looked at leases in New Mexico and Texas, the leases in Texas were more attractive in certain, like, adjoining border. The leases in Texas were much more attractive in the Obama administration. When the Trump administration came in and began to do activity and create regular APD processing to create some mechanism that created a greater degree of comfort, those leases became more attractive, much more attractive, even than the leases on the other side of the border. And so I think that that's an indication that there's a lot of resource, like there is a willingness, if there's confidence, that the regulatory paradigm will work. So I believe, and really what happened in the Trump administration on federal lands is really the revolution that had taken place to a certain extent on private lands. You know, we just were able to kind of replicate that, and you saw that in lease bids and other things. So, and when you said you've looked at this, you know, from an international perspective, when you look at where the world is going, population and everything else, it's almost impossible for me to not believe that we desperately need to produce these resources over time in the future. So thanks for that question. That was a great question.
Great. Yes, sir. Here in the front. Well, she's bringing you a mic over.
I worked with the Civil War Trust for a long
yeah.
time, volunteering for them. And of course, the trust had the attitude that, you know, you don't want anything to screw up this land. And my attitude was always, that's great. And in the future, if the things change, you can always dig it up later. But the fact that it's preserved for now makes it available if priorities change. How do you deal with people who say, all right, so oil right now is worth a certain amount. 20 years, we're still going to need oil. Why don't we delay drilling? Because in 20 years, it will actually be more valuable. We'll have better techniques for getting it out.
So my view of that is, and the example you used is fantastic because, you know, there's resources that are deployed to protect battlefields, right? We spend money to do that. I spend a lot of time going to Bull Run and outside Manassas. I love going out there. It's some of the closest public land that I can get to from Arlington. And they're protected for a particular reason, right? That's not land that's a multiple use. On the other hand, on lands that are multiple use, and even some lands that you know, have particular pre-existing rights, but on lands that are multiple use, Congress has said, here's the purposes for these lands. And they include mineral development, oil and gas development. So my view on that question is that those are questions for Congress to answer. And it is Congress's land. I have a view of what it should be, how it should be used. But my view doesn't matter. What matters is what Congress says. And that's what matters to the Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary of the Interior doesn't get a pick. You know, if they want to withdraw land, there's a process to do that and take it back to Congress. But that's my view is like Congress set the bar to deal with that and believes that there's an economic benefit today for society in developing these minerals. And so they get to make that choice. And you and I get to vote for that member of Congress every time they come around, and we should express our view to them.
I think we have one over here, and we'll make that the last question of the day.
Thanks. Elena Sims,
nice.
Hudson Institute. I spent some time living in Anchorage over the
Oh, you
last
did?
year. I did. And the Alaska legislature just opened up public lands to carbon credits and sequestration. I'm curious what changes to federal policy you might recommend to bring innovation like CCUS to federal lands.
Well, I think, you know, this is something that Congress has to decide, in my opinion. I think this administration is probably going to try and promote some regulations that do that. Whether they need additional legal authority, I think is a really important question. But, you know, there are issues that they'll have to work through, like what's the value of that? And, you know, it's more complex in some areas because on federal land it may be easy, but, you know, for example, on some land the surface is held privately, but then the subsurface is held, the mineral estate is held by the federal government. And many state laws say that the surface owner actually owns the pore space, so the room within, the environment, that's not the mineral owners. And so there's a lot of questions like that they have to work through in identifying, number one, they have the authority, and number two, can they do it, and what conditions do they put on it? It's always interesting to me to think about, there's a lot of CCE, there's enhanced recovery that's done a lot. But if you have one federal agency that's going to say this stuff is a pollutant, what does that mean to the person who's signing the document at the Department of the Interior? So there's a lot of really interesting questions associated with it. And that's what happens with all sorts of new technology that might be utilized on these lands.
Well, Secretary Bernhardt, we appreciate your time today. Appreciate
Thanks for
you
having
coming.
me.
And ladies and gentlemen in the audience and online, thank you for attending. This concludes our event.